Hey guys, Jacqueline here, and welcome to part 8 of how to make a 2D RPG in Unity. In this video, we'll be starting our inventory system. We'll start by creating the inventory structure, then we'll move on to adding items to our inventory. Before we begin, let's talk about what this is going to look like. First, let's walk through an example from our game. Let's say that our player picks up a seed pack from the ground by walking over it. Then the seed pack will tell the inventory that it was picked up and needs to be added to the inventory. Then, the inventory is going to look to see if we already have an item of this type in our inventory. If we do, then we'll look to see if we can add any more items to the slot. If so, then we'll add it to the slot and exit the logic for adding items. But if the slot is full or there isn't that type of item in our inventory yet, we will want to add it to the first available empty space. So now that we know how we want to work, we can get started creating it. First, create a new C# script in your scripts folder called inventory, then double-click it to open it. Once the script is open, delete the mono behavior from the class definition. We're not going to be adding the inventory script to any of the game objects in the scene. Instead, we're going to create a new inventory that lives on the player. We can also delete the start and update function since we can't use them anymore. We can only use them when we derive from mono behavior. The first thing that we need to do in our inventory is set up our slot objects. Create a new public class called slot inside of our inventory class. Then we need to think about what we want the slot to keep track of. We should also know what item it is holding, how many of that item it's holding, and also the maximum number that it is allowed to hold. So let's add some variables to the slot class. First, we'll add a public integer variable called count. The count will keep track of how many items are in the slot. To keep track of the maximum allowed, we should create another public integer variable called max allowed. The only thing that we need now is to keep track of our item type. We currently don't have a way to do this, so let's create one. Head to your collectible script. Beneath the class, create a new public enum called collectible type. Let's add two types to the enum. First, we'll add none for when the slot is empty, and the second one will be carrot seeds. An enum is a set of named constants that have an underlying numeric type. By default, the associated constant value of an enum are integers. They start with 0 and increase by 1 following the definition of the text order. So none is equal to 0 and carrot seeds is equal to 1. We are using an enum to keep track of these types because they make it very easy to read and track logically. With our collectible types defined, let's give our collectible a type. Scroll up to the top of the class and create a public collectible type variable and name it type. Save the script and head back to our inventory. Back in the slot class, let's add our public collectible type variable above our count and max allowed. Let's also name this variable type. Next, let's create our list of slots in our inventory. I'm going to add it below our slot class and set it equal to a new list. Now we have a list of slots, but it's an empty list. We need to set up the list before we can handle adding anything to the inventory. If we have no slots, then we can't add anything. So let's set up the list. Under the slots, we are going to create a constructor for our inventory. A constructor is a function that gets called when the object of the class is created. So when we create our inventory, it will call the constructor and set up our slot list. Let's pass in a parameter to our inventory constructor. Let's make it an integer and call it num slots. Then, inside the constructor, we need to set up our slots. So let's use a for loop and loop through the number of slots our inventory has, which we pass into the function. Then, inside the for loop, we can create a new slot and add it to the slot list. Now, when our inventory is created, it will have all the slots it needs. But we need to set up the slots when they get created too, so let's also add a constructor to the slot class. In the constructor, we're going to set all of our variables to a default value. We will set our type to none and the count to 0. We'll also set a default value for how many items the slot can hold. I'm going to set my max allowed to 99 for now. Great, now that we've got our inventory and slot set up, let's add a way for our players to add items to their inventory when they pick them up. In our inventory class, after the constructor, let's add a function called add. Let's give it a parameter of collectible type. Inside of the add function, we need to search our inventory for any items that are the same type as the item we're trying to add. Let's use a for each loop to do that. Then inside the loop, we can check if the slot.type is equal to the type that we passed into the function. If it is, we should check to see if we can add the item to the slot. In the slot class, under the constructor, create a public bool function called canAddItem. Then inside the function, we should check if the count is less than the max allowed. If it is, then we can return true to let the inventory know that it can add the item. If the count is equal to or greater than the max allowed, we should return false to let the inventory know that the item cannot be added to this slot. Back in the add function of the inventory, let's check to see if the slot can add the item. If both of these conditions are true, we can add the item to the slot. Let's create a function in the slot to add the item. In the slot class, under the canAddItem function, let's create a new function of type public void called addItem. The addItem function will take a parameter of the item type that we are adding. Then, in the function, let's set the type of the slot equal to the type that we're passing in. Let's also add 1 to our count. Great! Head back to the add function in the inventory class. Let's add the item to the slot inside of the if statement. We can say slot.addItem and pass in the type that we passed into the add function. Now we can exit the process of adding an item since we've already added one. So let's return from the function. We can now add an item to the inventory if we already have an item of that type. Now, let's add an item if we don't yet have that type, or if the slot is full. After the for each loop in the add function, let's add another for each loop that loops through all of the slots in the slot list. Then, inside of the for each loop, we can check if the type of the slot is none. If it is, then we can add the item to the slot and return. There is one more thing that we need to do so we can see the inventory in the inspector in Unity. We need to make the class serializable. Above the class definition, let's add the system.serializable tag. Let's also add one above the slot class as well so we can see all of the slots in the inspector. Save the script and open your player script. Delete the num_seeds variable from the script. Then let's add an inventory to the player. Create a public inventory variable at the top of the class. Now we have to create a new inventory when we start the game, so let's add an awake function. Inside of the awake function, let's create a new inventory, passing in how many slots we want the inventory to have. I'm going to pass in 21 for now. Save the script and open the collectible script. You'll notice that we now have an error. The error is coming from the line where we were incrementing the num_seeds variable in the player script. We deleted the num_seeds variable so we can no longer access it. Instead, let's add the item to the inventory. We can do so by replacing it with player.inventory.add and pass in our collectible type. The error should be resolved. Save the script and go to Unity. Take a look at the collectible in the scene. You'll see that it now has a variable called type. Click on it and select seeds from the list. Save and hit play. When you walk into the collectible, the behavior in the game should look the same as it did before. The collectible should disappear. But click on the player and check the inspector. You should see an inventory variable. If you click on it, it should expand to see the slots list. Then expand the slots list to see all the slots. Expand the first slot. The slot should be of type seeds and have a count of 1. Stop playing and let's create a prefab for our collectible item. Open your prefabs folder in the project view. Click and drag the collectible from the scene into the folder. This will create a prefab. We now have a copy of our collectible so that we can easily update it and correct all of the collectibles in our scene later. In the next video, we're going to be creating the inventory UI, as well as adding functionality to remove items from our inventory. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a lot, and I will see you next time.